and I'm going to be speaking about analyzing terrorist networks. My talk is structured in three parts. I heard the word reshape used by Professor Antonori, and I'm going to start by looking at networks of terrorists and how we might reshape those to reduce their lethality. After that, I'm going to be talking about two ongoing projects we have, one on analyzing data in Twitter at a very large scale, another on analyzing data on YouTube. And then I'll say a little bit about the upcoming threats over the next few years. Specifically, Professor Antonori, our distinguished chairman, have both mentioned cybersecurity. And I know the next speaker will speak more about that. I'll say a little bit about that. Let me start with our system Stone, which is intended to reshape terrorist networks. Now, before I continue with this, let me say a little bit about social networks and social media in general. Social media has two major parts: the content of what's in the social media posts, whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter, and the structure of the network. Who is connected to whom? Who is following whom? And the latter is very, very helpful. For those of you who might have used LinkedIn, you probably see suggestions made by LinkedIn on who you should connect to. That's an example of social network analysis being used, looking at both profiles of people, which is text, as well as the connections that they currently share with other people. So let me start. When I started looking at the problem of figuring out how to degrade the lethality of a terrorist network, I was astonished that people claimed huge amounts of success in destabilizing these networks with no concrete measures that you could point to. So we broke up this problem of how to reshape a terrorist network into four parts. The first was to come up with a predictive model which can capture the lethality of a network. In our case, that meant how many attacks will this network carry out? Once I have that measure, I can say, if we target this individual in a network, what will be the impact on that lethality? Will it go up or down? And you might be surprised by some of the results. I'll come to that. Once I know what the network, who might replace a terrorist as a leader when he or she is removed, I can come up with a probability distribution saying the new network is going to look like this or like this or like this. I'll say more about that as well. Once we have that, I know that if I remove this set of people, the network might look like this with some probability, like this with some probability, and like this with some probability. I know how to measure the lethality because I've got the lethality model. So then I can go back to the question of who should we target so that we minimize the lethality of this network. For any technologists in the room, that's expected lethality, but I won't belabor that. This picture you see on the right is a small part of a network associated with the terrorist group Lashkar-e-Taiba. The network for us consists of a bunch of nodes, people, and a bunch of edges. Who's a friend of whom, who worked with somebody, who collaborated with someone on an attack, who trained with someone, things like that. Each of these nodes has some properties. Those properties might say, here's the role of the person, here's the rank of the person in the organization, here is his or her faction to which he or she belongs, etc. And before I continue, I just want to go back to an ordinary social network like Twitter or Facebook. You have the same structure. You've got nodes, people, organizations, events. You've got connections between them. Some of these connections may go in one direction, but not the other. I might follow you, but you might not follow me. On the other hand, in some networks, it might be a two-way street. There may be other things people do. So again, think nodes, edges connecting those nodes, and relationships linking those together, whether in a terrorist network or a network of people on a social media site, whether it's Twitter or vContact or something else. How do we measure and predict the lethality of a network? I won't go into the gory details, but we had time series data for 4 terrorist networks, longitudinal data over a period of time. And we knew that this is what the network looked like. I'm calling it N1 on the slide when we started. And during the time this network was in force, a certain number of attacks, which I'm calling A1, occurred. 10 attacks, 20 attacks, you might replace the number of attacks by the magnitude of those attacks measured in some way. And the same principles are going to apply. So I've got this network N1, and at some point, some new people joined the network, some old people left the network. So I got a network N2 that carried out some attacks, and so forth. From this, we can use a well-known statistical technique called regression by measuring various technical properties of these networks to predict what is the link between the properties, structural properties of the network, that is the topography of the network, and the properties of the individuals and the nature of those relationships in the network, to try and predict how many attacks a hypothetical network might carry out. A hypothetical network such as that which might result if you were to target a few people in the network. So the predictive model we had here was tested on 2 networks, and the way we measure the predictive accuracy of these models is to say, if we compare the numbers we predict with the actual ground truth numbers, what is the degree of agreement between them? That is a number which is statistically called a Pearson correlation coefficient that varies between -1 and +1. -1 to say the two quantities being compared are completely negatively linked to each other, +1 saying it's completely positive. We were getting numbers of around 0.8 with our predictive models. Please note that I don't have to construct these models for every group. I have algorithms that will automatically learn these models for these groups once you have the data. When a terrorist is removed from the network, we want to predict who might replace him. We want to say, if you remove this guy, it's going to be this person replacing him, this person replacing him, this person replacing him, with some probabilities. 10% that it's going to be this person, 20 that this, 30 that it's this. We hypothesize that there'd be a number of properties, such as the role of the person, their connectedness in their network. In other words, what is the density of support around them? So for example, if I have 2 people who are independently my friends, they can help me. But if they're also friends of each other, they can help me even more, okay? So that's what I mean by connectedness. Influence is a factor in networks that we measured through a variant of Google's PageRank algorithm, okay? And we were able to define the successor of a node through a set of 4 steps. Identify the probability, identify a set of candidates who can replace the node, the person, identify how the influence changes if that person is removed, and then come up with a probability distribution which tells us what the probabilities are. I won't go into the gory details, but this shows you a picture of what happens if you remove the head of the terrorist group Lashkar-e-Taiba, okay? This can be again applied to any terrorist network. We've applied it before. So if you look here, here's the interesting thing in this particular network. The head of this network, Hafez Mohammed Saeed, is, if you remove him, the lethality of the network actually goes up, okay? You would think that's counterintuitive, but intuitively think of an organization where you have a boss or a specific high-level person who is incompetent. If you remove him, the network might actually get more efficient at what it does. We all know organizations and have experienced situations like that. Same thing's happening here. And this picture here on the right shows you 3 networks that might be formed with the associated lethalities. That's the number L4 that you see. By the way, there's a minus preceding each of those numbers, showing that it actually increases. So -37 is greater than -45. And this basically says, look, if you remove this person, you're going to make matters worse. I'll skip over a couple of these slides, but we tested this quite extensively on 4 data sets, about 4 different terrorist networks: Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Lashkar. And in 80% of the cases, one of our top 3 predictions was in fact the person who was the replacement, even at lower levels in the organizational hierarchy. I'm not just talking about the top guy. I just gave an example. So as an example, I'm in the prediction business. I don't like coming to places and giving a talk with no predictions. So this is a prediction. So if Hassan Nasrallah was to be removed, I'm not recommending that by any means. As the head of Hezbollah, these are our 4 picks for who would succeed him, okay? Let me go from here to what you all came to listen about, social media. Again, before I make this transition from social networks to social media, I want to say that the principles of analytics that we apply to social networks apply directly. I can take everything I just talked about and say, I've got the terrorist network replaced by a network of individuals on Twitter, on vContact, on Telegram, on Ask.fm, all known to be used by groups like ISIL. And I can look at that and say, who do we want to target in this network for an offensive operation? Let me talk about two pieces of work. But before I do that, let me talk about the art of the possible. So bots, we've heard a lot about that in the press recently. Last year, DARPA ran a challenge to identify bots that seek to influence opinion on a specific topic on Twitter. I was fortunate to lead the team of very good researchers that won that challenge. And the basic idea that you can expect to see in the future are armies of bots intended to reshape opinion. We haven't seen as much of that on Twitter being used by groups like ISIL, but we can expect to see that. And I just want to say that there are now very good methods to generate bots and deploy them, and also pretty good methods to discover them. Okay. Diffusion. Professor Antonori talked about diffusion as well. He mentioned that word. It's really critical. Think of a network of individuals on Twitter or Facebook or vContact, and think of some of these nodes in the network being labeled with a red dot. Think of that much like a disease. This person has been infected with support for ISIS or for some other group, whichever one you're interested in studying. Diffusion basically tries to study the properties of how this red dot's going to spread. We did a 10-month study using 600 million tweets and 17 million users on the 2014 Indian election. We were able to predict very accurately the number of supporters and the number of opponents of each of 31 entities participating in that election by learning diffusion models of that. Identifying key influencers, who's shaping opinion. It's not necessarily the person who has the most followers. We tend to think this is right. But in fact, if you want to measure my influence on a topic, you want to see how much on a specific topic, how many people are infected by whatever enthusiasm I might have for that topic, if I was to talk about it, and the number who might be infected if I did not talk about it. The difference between those two quantities, what happens if I do, what happens if I don't, is my contribution to that infection. It's not the number of followers. So we may have celebrities who are talking about these things, and they don't get anywhere, okay, on a particular topic, like terrorism. So Shaquille O'Neal, famous basketball player, may be very influential in lots of things, but perhaps not on terrorism. Last but not least, there's a lot of technology out there, put out by the Googles of the world, by the Amazons, to identify fraudulent and bogus transactions. These include everything from SMS fraud, to putting fake information up on Wikipedia, to looking at fake accounts on Facebook, to trolling. We've got pretty good techniques for that, to do that kind of analysis. As an example, we recently reported 250 accounts to a major e-marketplace, and they came back to us and said 204 of those were right, according to their own investigation. A little bit about, by the way, my next few slides on our ISIL work and our YouTube work is very much work in progress, not done. And here we collected over a period of about 3.5 years, about just under 1.5 million tweets related to ISIS, so of course we processed a lot of crap on the order of 260 million tweets a day, and distilled that down to about 1.5 million. About 700K plus users, but the reason this is a work in progress is because it's not been a refereed and reviewed publication at this point, partly because we haven't written it. And one of the reasons is that we only have about 4,000 geotagged tweets, so we're looking at applying some techniques to increase that number. A little bit about Twitter sentiment towards ISIL across the entire 3.5-year period. If you look at the chart on the right, you will see that the red are the people is the number of tweets that are pro-ISIL. The green is the number that are anti, and the gray is the neutral zone, okay? It's very interesting to see these three curves on this graph. The numbers go up or go down more or less in sync. This is a visualization of some of the countries where sentiment on average is most favorable towards ISIL across the entire 3.5-year time frame. If I look at the first 6 months of this time frame, I see the countries, some of which were a surprise to me, I might add, like Hungary, Germany, Malaysia, Chile, Indonesia. And at the end of this 3.5-year period, it was there were some some countries that still stayed on that list, like Malaysia, and Indonesia, but others who came in new. Again, please let me emphasize this is very much a work in progress, and you should think of these as interim results. This is the fraction of accounts from a particular country that talk about ISIS that seem to be supportive of it. Again, the two countries that I see repeated are Indonesia and Malaysia. Let me skip forward a little bit, and we did something similar with YouTube, and just say a little bit about the upcoming threat landscape in my last 2 minutes. I would expect in the next few years to see a significant increase in some low-hanging fruit for terrorists to raise finances. SMS fraud through a bunch of... So SMS fraud, for example, is when your phone is infected by malware and sends out SMSs to a premium rate message service. Basically, you're paying that account plus the privilege of interacting with it. Ransomware is increasing significantly over the last few years. You can expect to see more of this. Banking Trojans, there are actually now pieces of malware like Cobalt, which will actually cause ATMs to spit out cash. Terrorists are likely to look at existing malware, such as those that are listed on this slide, and say, here's how we can take these existing resources and leverage them to generate money for us without ever getting a visa to go somewhere, without ever having to board a plane. And last but not least, in many of these cases, the finances are channeled through cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. I'll conclude by saying that I would expect our distinguished chairman here said something about attacks on infrastructure. I would expect that we would see significant attacks, not in the next 2 years, but in the next 5 to 10 years, on SCADA systems and IoT systems. There have obviously been a bunch of examples that have already occurred, none in a major way, to my knowledge, due to a terrorist network, but I expect that to happen. Thank you very much.